In the freezing autumn of 1980, deep inside the windowless rooms of the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., a group of CIA analysts were staring at a set of grainy satellite images that defied logic. The photos had been taken by a KH-9 hexagon spy satellite passing over the secret Severodvinsk shipyard in the Soviet Arctic. For years, the analysts had watched the Soviets build submarines. They knew the shapes, the sizes, and the patterns. But what they saw emerging from the covered construction hall known as Building 55 was something that shouldn't have existed. It was a silhouette so massive that at first the senior analysts assumed the lens calibration was broken. They measured it again and again. The object was 574 feet long, longer than the Washington Monument. But it was the width that was truly terrifying. It was nearly 80 feet wide. It displaced 48,000 tons of water submerged. To put that into perspective, that is more than the displacement of a World War II aircraft carrier. It was double the size of the American Ohio-class submarine, which was already considered a giant. The CIA gave it the code name Typhoon. The Soviets called it Project 941 Akula, or Shark. But to the terrified generals in the Pentagon, it was simply the monster. The emergence of the Typhoon sent shockwaves through the Western intelligence community. The sheer scale of the vessel suggested that the Soviet Union had made a terrifying leap in naval engineering. Why build something so big? What kind of doomsday weapon required a launch platform the size of a floating city? Panic began to set in. Estimates were drawn up. Briefings were rushed to the president. The West feared that the Typhoon was an indestructible fortress, a leviathan designed to rule the oceans and shrug off American torpedoes like mosquito bites. But what the Americans didn't know, what they couldn't possibly see from space, was that the Typhoon wasn't a triumph of Soviet genius. It was a monument to Soviet failure. The reason the Typhoon was the biggest submarine in history wasn't because the Soviets wanted it to be. It was because it had to be. To understand the Typhoon, and to understand the roast of Soviet engineering, you have to look at the missiles. In the Cold War arms race, the holy grail of nuclear deterrence was the solid-fuel ballistic missile. The Americans had mastered this technology with the Trident missile. Solid fuel is stable, safer, and most importantly, compact. Because American engineers could build powerful miniature warheads and efficient rocket motors, the Trident missile was sleek and relatively small. This allowed the U.S. Navy to build the Ohio-class submarine, a vessel that was large, yes, but efficient, quiet, and streamlined. The Soviets, however, were lagging behind in chemical engineering and microelectronics. They desperately wanted a solid-fuel missile to match the Americans, but they simply couldn't make it small. Their answer was the R-39 RIF. It was a ballistic nightmare. It had the same range as the American missile, but it was enormous. It weighed 84 tons, 3 times the weight of its American counterpart. It was nearly as big as a school bus. This created a massive architectural problem for the Soviet naval architects at the Rubin Design Bureau. They were ordered to fit 20 of these gargantuan missiles onto a submarine. But the missiles were so tall and so wide that they wouldn't fit inside a standard pressure hull. If they built a normal submarine around these missiles, it would be so long it would snap in half in rough seas. So they came up with a design that was equal parts madness and brilliance. They didn't build one submarine. They built 2. The Typhoon is actually 2 separate pressure hulls, 2 smaller submarines laid side by side like a catamaran, and then wrapped in a massive outer shell of steel. The missile silos were placed in the space between the 2 hulls. It was a design of brute force. Because they couldn't miniaturize the weapon, they had to maximize the ship. They built a cathedral to house a clumsy god. But if the exterior was a testament to engineering struggles, the interior was a testament to Soviet insanity. The mission profile of the Typhoon was unique. Unlike American subs that patrolled the open ocean, the Typhoon was designed to hide. It would leave port and head straight for the Arctic ice cap. It would dive under the ice and sit there silently for up to 120 days at a time. It was a strategy known as the Ice Bastion. If World War III started, the Typhoon would punch through 3 meters of solid ice and launch its nuclear payload. But spending 4 months trapped inside a steel tube underwater in total darkness is a psychological torture test. The Soviet High Command worried that the crews, the elite officers of the Northern Fleet, would go insane or mutiny from the stress. They needed to keep the crew happy. They needed to distract them from the fact that they were living in a nuclear tomb. So in a decision that baffles naval historians to this day, the Soviet Union decided to turn the world's deadliest warship into a floating luxury hotel. While the average Soviet citizen in Moscow stood in line for hours to buy sausage and toilet paper, and while conscripts in the Red Army were sleeping in freezing barracks with no heat, the crew of the Typhoon was living in opulence. Deep inside the forward section of the submarine, shielded by feet of steel and titanium, the engineers installed a swimming pool. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal swimming pool measuring about 4 meters long and 2 meters deep, filled with heated fresh water or filtered seawater depending on the mission. The tiles were blue. The lighting was designed to mimic a soft tropical day. After a long shift monitoring the nuclear reactor, a Soviet officer could put on his swim trunks and swim laps 400 meters beneath the surface of the Arctic Ocean. But they didn't stop at the pool. Next to the pool was a fully functioning sauna banya. It was lined with high-quality oak planks smelling of wood and steam. It was a piece of traditional Russia brought into the deep. Officers would sweat out the toxins and stress of the Cold War, hitting each other with birch branches before jumping into the pool to cool off. And the luxury continued. There was a solarium equipped with tanning beds to provide ultraviolet light, preventing rickets and keeping the crew looking tanned despite never seeing the sun for months. There was a gymnasium with weight machines and treadmills. There was a relaxation zone that featured a fake fireplace, an electric hearth with glowing red lights to simulate burning logs. There were rocking chairs. There was a dedicated smoking room with air filtration systems so powerful that the smoke wouldn't contaminate the rest of the ship. There was even a small nature corner, a mini garden with artificial plants, and a cage containing live birds, parakeets or canaries to provide the sound of nature. The contrast was staggering. It was grotesque. It was a Potemkin village underwater. The sheer cost of these amenities was astronomical. Every cubic inch of space on a submarine is precious. On an American Los Angeles-class sub, the crew hot-bunked, sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough beds. The passageways were so narrow, you had to turn sideways to let someone pass. The food was freeze-dried. The shower was a 2-minute trickle. The Americans prioritized sensors, weapons, and silence. They spent their budget on making the boat invisible. The Soviets, meanwhile, were spending millions of rubles to haul tons of marble oak and pool filtration systems into a war zone. It was a symbol of the Soviet Union's misplaced priorities. They could build a sauna under the ocean, but they couldn't build a grocery store that had food on the shelves. When the Dmitry Donskoy finally put to sea for sea trials, the sheer magnitude of the waste became apparent. The Typhoon required a crew of 160 men to operate. It was a beast to maneuver. But its size created a tactical nightmare. While the rubber anechoic tiles made it surprisingly quiet for its size, it couldn't hide its magnetic signature. That much steel, 48,000 tons of it, created a massive disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field. American anti-submarine aircraft flying overhead with magnetic anomaly detectors could spot a typhoon from miles away. It was like trying to hide an elephant in a swimming pool. You might cover it with water, but the water level is going to rise. The invisible bastion was actually a massive magnetic beacon. Furthermore, the cost of operating the Typhoon was bleeding the Soviet Navy dry. The specialized infrastructure needed to dock, it was immense. The piers had to be rebuilt. The cranes had to be upgraded to load the massive R-39 missiles. And the pool, keeping a pool clean and heated on a nuclear submarine is not trivial. It required fresh water, chemicals, and energy. While the reactor provided plenty of power, the maintenance was a headache. If the pool leaked, it could corrode the pressure hull. If the humidity from the sauna wasn't controlled, it could short-circuit the missile fire control systems. The Soviet engineers had built a technological marvel, but they had forgotten the basic rule of warfare: keep it simple. As the Cold War dragged on into the 1980s, the Typhoon became a symbol of everything wrong with the Soviet military-industrial complex. It was impressive to look at. It terrified the public. It made for great propaganda photos. But strategically, it was a white elephant. The Americans watched with a mix of fear and amusement. They realized that for every Typhoon the Soviets built, they were bankrupting themselves a little bit more. The U.S. Navy didn't need to build a bigger submarine to counter it. They just needed to wait for the Soviet economy to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Imagine the scene. It is 1984. Deep under the polar ice cap, the world is on the brink of nuclear war. In the control room, the captain is tense, waiting for orders that could end civilization. But down in the relaxation sector, a lieutenant is sitting in a rocking chair in front of a fake fireplace, smoking a cigarette, while his comrade does a cannonball into a swimming pool. It was the height of absurdity. It was the peak of Soviet hubris. And it was a secret that, when finally revealed to the struggling Soviet public years later, would cause not pride but outrage. They had starved so that the Navy could swim. While the Soviet officers were enjoying their sauna and swimming laps beneath the Arctic ice, a different kind of predator was prowling the southern waters. The United States Navy had watched the construction of the Typhoon with alarm, but their response was not to build a bigger boat. It was to build a smarter one. Enter the Ohio-class submarine. If the Typhoon was a sledgehammer, the Ohio was a sniper rifle. The contrast between these two vessels tells the entire story of the Cold War's end. One nation prioritized ego and size, while the other prioritized efficiency and lethality. To understand the humiliation of the Typhoon, you have to look at the math. The Soviet Typhoon displaced 48,000 tons and required a crew of 160 men to operate. It carried 20 ballistic missiles. The American Ohio-class displaced only 18,750 tons, less than half the size of the Typhoon, and required a crew of only 155. Yet, miraculously, the smaller American boat carried 24 missiles. The Americans had built a ship half the size that carried 20% more firepower. This was the result of the superior American chemical engineering we discussed earlier. The Trident II D5 missile was a masterpiece of miniaturization. It was compact, reliable, and terrifyingly accurate. Because the missile was small, the submarine could be small. Because the submarine was small, it was faster, quieter, and cheaper to maintain. The Soviets had built a cathedral to house their clumsy missiles. The Americans had built a Porsche to carry their deadly ones. The tactical comparison was even worse for the Soviets. The Typhoon was designed to hide in the ice bastion protected by the polar cap. The Soviets believed that the sheer size of the Typhoon combined with its reinforced sail allowed it to punch through ice up to 3 meters thick to launch its missiles. It was a terrifying capability, but hiding is difficult when you are the largest metal object in the ocean. While the Typhoon was quieter than previous Soviet submarines thanks to its rubber coating, Its immense size created a unique vulnerability, magnetic anomaly detection (MOD). A submarine is essentially a giant steel tube moving through the Earth's magnetic field. The bigger the tube, the bigger the disturbance. American P-3 Orion patrol aircraft flying over the Arctic could detect the magnetic signature of a typhoon from high altitude. It was like trying to hide a tank in a swimming pool. You couldn't see it, but you could feel the water displacement. The invisible monster was actually a magnetic beacon screaming its location to NATO sensors. Furthermore, the Typhoon had a logistical Achilles heel that would eventually bankrupt the Soviet Navy. The R-39 missiles, the massive 84-ton rockets, were so heavy that they couldn't be transported by normal means. In the United States, Trident missiles could be moved by standard rail or truck. In the Soviet Union, the infrastructure had to be rebuilt to accommodate the Typhoon's weapons. They had to build a special massive crane ship just to load the missiles. They had to reinforce the railway lines leading to the naval bases because the weight of the missile trains would crush standard tracks. They had to dredge the harbors deeper because the Typhoon drew so much water. The cost of the support system alone was enough to fund an entire fleet of smaller submarines. The Soviet Union was bleeding money to support a weapon that spent most of its time sitting at a dock, waiting for a war that everyone prayed would never happen. Then came the cat-and-mouse game. The U.S. Navy deployed its Los Angeles-class attack submarines to the Arctic. These were hunter-killers designed specifically to find and destroy Soviet ballistic missile subs. The American captains quickly learned that the Typhoon, despite its intimidating size, was a lumbering target. It was slow to maneuver. Its double-hull design, while making it hard to sink with a single torpedo, also created complex acoustic echoes that skilled American sonar operators could exploit. The Americans would sit silently near the exits of the Soviet naval bases waiting. As soon as a Typhoon left port, an American shadow would fall in behind it. There are declassified accounts of U.S. submarines trailing Typhoons for weeks, recording their sound signatures, mapping their habits, and virtually sinking them dozens of times in simulations. The Soviet captains, enjoying their bird aviaries and smoking rooms, often had no idea that an American Mark 48 torpedo was locked onto their propellers. But the real killer of the Typhoon wasn't the American Navy. It was the Soviet economy. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The price of oil plummeted. The shelves in Moscow were empty. The ruble was worthless. And yet the Typhoon fleet required millions of dollars a month just to keep the lights on. Remember the pool and the sauna and the massive heating systems required to keep the ship operational in the Arctic winter. Those luxuries suddenly became liabilities. As the budget for the Navy was slashed, maintenance suffered. The rubber anechoic tiles began to fall off the hulls, increasing the noise. The complex reactor systems began to fail. The hotel services inside the sub were shut down. The pool was drained. The sauna was locked. The birds died. The Typhoon crews went from living in luxury to living in a freezing, decaying steel tomb. There is a specific incident that highlights the absurdity of the situation. In the final years of the USSR, a Typhoon returned to base with a technical fault. The specialized crane required to lift the missile hatch cover was broken. Because the system was so unique and so massive, there were no spare parts available. The submarine, the most powerful warship ever built capable of ending civilization, was rendered useless because of a broken crane part that the bankrupt state couldn't afford to replace. It sat at the dock, a nuclear-armed paperweight, while the sailors on board weren't being paid. The contrast with the American Ohio class during this period is stark. The U.S. economy was booming in the 90s. The Ohio submarines were running like clockwork. They were patrolling the oceans 24/7, silent and deadly. They were being upgraded with better electronics and more accurate missiles. While the Soviet sailors were stripping copper wire from their own ships to sell for food, the American crews were watching movies on plasma screens in their mess halls. The Ohio class proved that in a long-term strategic competition, sustainability wins over size. You don't win a war by building the biggest weapon. You win by building the weapon you can actually afford to use. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, the Typhoon fleet was orphaned. The new Russian Federation couldn't afford them. They were too big, too complex, and too expensive. The strategic rationale for them vanished. Why keep a submarine that costs as much as a small city to operate when a smaller Delta-class sub could do the same job for a fraction of the price the Typhoons were doomed? They became the unwanted children of the Cold War giant dinosaurs that had survived the meteor impact, but were now starving in the New World. One by one, they were taken out of service. The TK-202, TK-12, TK-13. These majestic giants were towed to the scrapyards. But even dying was difficult for a Typhoon. They were so big and contained so much nuclear material that Russia couldn't afford to dismantle them safely. In a final supreme irony, it was the United States that paid for their destruction under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. The U.S. government wrote the checks to cut up the Typhoon submarines. American taxpayer money hired the workers and built the equipment to slice open the pressure hulls and remove the reactors. The Americans literally bought their enemy's doomsday machine and turned it into razor blades. Only one Typhoon survived the purge, the Dmitry Donskoy. It was kept as a test bed for new missiles, a lonely relic paraded out for Navy days to remind the world that Russia once built giants. But even the Donskoy was eventually retired in 2023. The swimming pool is gone. The birds are gone. The sauna is cold. All that remains is the legend of a ship that was too big to fail and yet too big to survive. The story of the Typhoon versus the Ohio is the ultimate lesson in engineering philosophy. The Soviets asked, "How big can we make it?" The Americans asked, "How effective can we make it?" The Soviets built a monument to their ego, complete with luxuries to mask the misery of their reality. The Americans built a tool of war. In the end, the swimming pool didn't save the Soviet Union. It just made the drowning a little more comfortable. The Typhoon was the greatest engineering feat of the Soviet Navy and simultaneously its greatest mistake. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had dissolved into chaos. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor, but a flag cannot feed a navy. The mighty Typhoon Class submarines, once the terror of the Western world, became the first victims of the new reality. Without the immense budget of a superpower to sustain them, these floating hotels became floating prisons. The sheer cost of operations, which had been ignored in the fervor of the arms race, now became an impossible burden for the bankrupt Russian Federation. The specialized infrastructure required to maintain the Typhoons began to crumble. The steam lines that kept the systems from freezing were turned off to save money. The heated swimming pools were drained, leaving behind cracked blue tiles and silence. The aviaries were emptied, the birds gone. The saunas sat cold and dark. The luxury that was meant to keep the crew sane became a haunting reminder of a failed empire. The tactical situation had also shifted dramatically. The Cold War was over. The need for a massive ice bastion fleet vanished. Russia needed a smaller, leaner navy to protect its borders, not a doomsday fleet to end the world. The strategic logic of the Typhoon, a massive carrier for massive missiles, evaporated. The Russian Navy looked at their balance sheet and realized a painful truth. For the cost of keeping one Typhoon operational, they could run 3 or 4 smaller Delta-class submarines. The choice was obvious. The giants had to go. But here lay the final, cruelest irony of the Typhoon project. They were so big, so complex, and filled with so much nuclear material and titanium that Russia couldn't even afford to throw them away. Scrapping a nuclear submarine is a dangerous, expensive engineering challenge. You have to safely remove the spent nuclear fuel, cut apart the pressure hulls, and dispose of the toxic waste. Russia didn't have the money to sail them, and they didn't have the money to scrap them. The Typhoons were left to rot at the piers of Severodvinsk and Nerpitya, their hulls rusting, their reactors ticking time bombs, threatening an environmental catastrophe in the Arctic. Enter the United States. In one of history's strangest twists, the winner of the Cold War stepped in to clean up the loser's mess. Under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, also known as the Nunn-Lugar Act, the United States government agreed to pay for the dismantling of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. American taxpayers literally wrote the checks to destroy the weapons that were built to kill them. American engineers arrived at the Russian shipyards not as prisoners but as supervisors. They brought heavy equipment, plasma cutters, and safety protocols. They watched as Russian workers sliced open the hulls of the TK-202, TK-12, and TK-13. The massive steel outer shells were peeled back to reveal the twin pressure hulls inside. The missile silos, which once held the city-killing R-39 rockets, were cut into scrap metal. The swimming pools, the saunas, the gyms, all of it was torn apart and melted down. The pride of the Soviet Navy was turned into razor blades and rebars paid for by the U.S. Treasury. It was the ultimate humiliation for the old Soviet admirals. Their greatest technological achievement was being erased by their enemy's wallet. While the Typhoons were being carved up, the American Ohio-class submarines were undergoing a transformation that proved the superiority of their design. The Ohio hull was so efficient and versatile that the U.S. Navy didn't scrap them. They upgraded them. 4 of the oldest Ohio boats, the USS Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and Georgia, were converted from ballistic missile submarines into guided missile submarines, SSGNs. Instead of carrying nuclear missiles to end the world, they were refitted to carry 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles each. They became convention warfare powerhouses, capable of parking off the coast of a rogue nation and delivering precision strikes with devastating volume. This evolution highlighted the fundamental difference in engineering philosophy. The Soviet Typhoon was a one-trick pony built for a single specific doomsday scenario. When that scenario didn't happen, the ship was useless. The American Ohio was a flexible platform, a tool that could adapt to a changing world. Today, those converted Ohio submarines are still in service, the most heavily armed conventional warships on the planet, silently patrolling the same oceans where the Typhoons have long since rusted away. Only one Typhoon was spared the scrapper's torch, for a time the Dmitry Donskoy TK-208. It was kept alive not as a combat vessel, but as a test bed for the new Bulava missile system. For years, it was the lone survivor, a museum piece kept on life support. The Russian Navy would trot it out for parades and propaganda videos. They would film the swimming pool, which was refurbished for the cameras to show the world that Mother Russia is still strong. But it was a hollow flex. The Donskoy rarely left port. It was a show pony, a nostalgic relic of a bygone era. Finally, in early 2023, even the Dmitry Donskoy was officially decommissioned. The last giant was dead. The era of the swimming pool submarine was over. The legacy of the Typhoon Class is a cautionary tale about ego versus efficiency. The Soviet Union built the Typhoon to answer the question, can we? They wanted to prove they could build the biggest, the most luxurious, the most terrifying machine on Earth. And they succeeded. But they forgot to ask, should we? They forgot that in war and in economics, biggest does not mean best. The Typhoon was a white elephant, a magnificent, awe-inspiring mistake. It consumed resources that could have saved the Soviet economy. It required infrastructure that the nation couldn't support. And in the end, it was defeated not by an American torpedo, but by American logistics and economic endurance. Today, the ocean floor is silent. The monsters are gone. But the Ohio-class submarines are still there. They are still patrolling unseen and unheard. They don't have swimming pools. They don't have saunas. They don't have bird aviaries. They have cramped bunks, mediocre food, and the most lethal, reliable nuclear deterrent in human history. The American engineers understood what the Soviets did not. A submarine is not a hotel. It is a weapon. And a weapon doesn't need to be comfortable. It needs to work. The Typhoon rests in the history books as a curiosity, a symbol of Soviet hubris. The Ohio rests in the deep, a symbol of American dominance. The pool is closed. The war is